Hello and welcome to Special Report on Euronews. I'm Maria Tadeo. We go from Evian to Brussels, where a meeting of the EU 27 leaders is currently underway. On the agenda, Ukraine. Off the back of that G7 meeting, talks around China. Can an economic rebalancing between Beijing and Brussels really happen? Or ultimately, are we heading into a trade war? And budget talks. The question of money among the 27 is always a difficult subject to the last cent. We will also check out with NATO after the U.S. today put allies on blast and called for a NATO 3.0. And just over this hour, a lot of confusion around a planned ceremony that was still scheduled to take place, or certainly was, in Switzerland to formalize that agreement cut between President Trump and Iran. At this hour, it's not clear that this will happen tomorrow. This, of course, after President Trump promised that the Strait of Hormuz would reopen on Friday with no tolls and real freedom of navigation. We'll go through all of these stories with our team of correspondents at the heart of negotiations in Brussels, NATO headquarters, and Switzerland. Also in Brussels, a major diplomatic spat between Israel and the top European diplomat Kaja Kallas. That after reports emerged that she may have compared the relationship between Palestinians and Israel as that of the apartheid in South Africa. The Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar has put out a statement today saying that he will cut off all communications with Kaja Kallas until she denies those reports or rejects them. Hopefully we can put that comment up on the board. The Israeli Foreign Minister insisting there will be no communication with Kaja Kallas until she either confirms the reports and takes them back or fully rejects them. In the meantime, the top European diplomat, after a very difficult week, she's not confirming or denying anything, but she's trying to take the heat off by saying the diplomacy is best handled through dialogue. At this hour, Israeli sources tell Euronews that they find the comments deeply offensive and racist. They want an apology for Kaja Kallas. As I say at this point, it's still not clear whether she said them, whether she's going to apologize or simply take them back, reject them, and move on. In the meantime, let's go now to our Ukraine correspondent, Sasha Vakulina, because the Ukrainian president is now with the EU 27 leaders. This is coming off the back of that statement from EU and G7 leaders, again reiterating that support for President Zelensky. And Sasha, also today, Ukraine really showing that it can hit, and it can hit hard, the heart of Moscow. Tell us more.
Indeed, Maria, Volodymyr Zelensky is here in Brussels, clearly seeking to capitalize on the strong momentum on two fronts at the same time, on the military front and on the diplomatic front. Now, on the military front, Ukraine's drone strike on Moscow's oil refinery, the second one on the same target within just a week, clearly proves that Ukraine can hit the most protected place in Russia. As Volodymyr Zelensky said, Moscow is protected by 3 rings of air defense. He also said that Ukraine will not stop its long-range strike campaign, saying, quote, "If Ukraine burns, so will Moscow." And on the diplomatic side, Zelensky is coming after this G7 summit as arguably the biggest winner. He managed to secure the support not only of the European leaders, but of all of the G7 leaders, specifically, of course, of Donald Trump, that all of them came up with a joint statement promising more support for Ukraine.
And Sasha, of course, we saw today that major explosion in a refinery. The war now really coming closer to home for Russians. But in terms of the summit today, the president of Ukraine wants to talk about accession, and he's saying he wants to join the European Union fast. Is he going to get that?
He did say that when he arrived to the summit with Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa. He said that he will discuss this afternoon with the EU leaders the possibility of opening all the rest of the clusters now, within few weeks, not even months. This is, of course, Zelensky pushing for this fast-track accession process, the idea that is not popular with several EU members who are saying that this is not fair and this is not just when it comes to the other EU candidates. So this will be quite a complex and difficult discussion here at the summit, Maria.
Indeed, and we've heard from the German Chancellor also pitch that associated membership, and the Hungarian Prime Minister making his Brussels debut, Peter Magyar, insisting that there will be no fast track for Ukraine. And on that note, a lot going on in Brussels, but I do want to bring in our guest on this show's special report, Jessica Rosenkravs. You are the European Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden. I want to kick in, perhaps going back to the G7 and ask you about that statement. The President of France, Emmanuel Macron, he said that he believes the G7 is a turning point for Ukraine, but also the relationship with President Trump and the Europeans. Is that how you read it?
Well, I mean, the Ukrainians are doing well on the battlefield. We see that Russia is having a lot of losses. The Russian economy is hurting. So in many ways, I see there's a good position for Ukraine. Now also with an agreement between the U.S. and Iran, there might be more possibility for the U.S. to direct its attention towards Ukraine. And we need to work together, Europe and U.S., to support Ukraine.
And that was a message that resonated in the G7 statement. I do want to ask you about this summit. We heard right here from the president of Ukraine saying that he wants in the European Union and he wants that to happen fast. Is that something your country, in unanimity around the 27 member states, can allow for, a fast entry of Ukraine into this European Union?
I would say that our support to Ukraine is existential. It's a moral obligation, but it is also an investment in European security. And this also comes down to enlargement. And Ukraine belongs in the European family. So Sweden is very supportive of both opening negotiations, which we did. I personally took part earlier this week when we opened the first cluster, and we need to open even more clusters.
And do you have high hopes for the new Hungarian Prime Minister? He is facilitating the clusters and the negotiations, but he also said no fast track and there will be a referendum membership.
I mean, we see advancements from the Ukrainian side. They are doing real reforms back home, which is impressive during an ongoing war. And when a candidate country delivers so must the EU. And therefore, it's a must that we continue with these negotiations. And I hear a completely new tone from the new Hungarian government, which makes me very happy. And I hope now during this summit that we can be 27 countries agreeing on our support to Ukraine.
And we'll hear from Peter Magyar at the end of the summit. I want to ask you about China because that is firmly on the agenda. We see that the Europeans are saying we need an economic rebalancing. That trade deficit is simply unsustainable. Can you get that through diplomacy, or ultimately this is headed for a trade war?
The Swedish government is often saying that we are probably the most free trade, pro-free trade government in the world, but it's also about a level playing field. I mean, when China plays according to different rules than the rest of us, then we must also reconsider our options, because China has a lot of subsidies, overproduction that they want to dump on the European market, and that makes it necessary for Europe to look at further tools in the toolbox.
And there's also a real question about the currency, the value, perhaps it's undervalued, and that's also helping unfairly the Chinese. But when you say we need new tools, what does that mean? What are you thinking about? Is that unless you comply, no access to the single market? Is that anti-coercion? What do you mean when you say new tools?
I mean, this is something that the leaders will discuss today, and what I think and hope is that we go from words to action, because we have seen for a long time that China has an aim of global economic domination, and that can potentially, and we already see it, that can hurt European businesses. So we have to rethink if China doesn't want to work with the EU in a level playing field, then we have to reconsider our options when it comes to trade, and we have to make sure that we have European businesses back. It doesn't mean that we don't want free trade. We want to continue to work also with China, but it needs to be a fair game.
And on that point, that's a strong statement to make, global economic domination. But to go back home and perhaps look at the European economy, today we're going to see budget talks finally begin really now in full force. This is always a difficult conversation for the Europeans, the money question. What do you hope to see? And how can you really deliver on a union that is independent when you are literally counting cents?
Well, we need a budget that focuses more on security and on competitiveness, and that we welcome in the proposal, but the volume is way too high. It needs to come down substantially.
By how much?
Well, from the Swedish point of view, we want a budget around 1% of GNI. So that's a substantial decrease. But a lot of member states are doing tough priorities back home. The EU needs to do the same kind of tough priorities. And it's about taking responsibility for taxpayers' money.
And just briefly, that means you're going to have to cut somewhere else. Do you go, well, now it's time to look at agriculture money, for example, cohesion, focus on other things?
I think we will need cuts across the board, but of course it makes sense to look at the really big parts of the budget, but there will have to be cuts across the board. But we want to maintain the focus on competitiveness and on security, because those are our main challenges in today's world.
Well, Minister, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews. Always a pleasure to see you. And of course, the Minister really presenting there what is the core of discussions here, a European budget that needs to work for all, but there's a real money question in terms of the priorities, who's going to pay for what. But in the meantime, I want to check in and go to our NATO correspondent, Shauna Murray, because Shauna, you were today at the NATO headquarters. We saw the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, say that European allies, certainly the Europeans, their behavior was shameful because they did not help the U.S. in the war in Iran, and also called for NATO 3.0. What does that mean?
Well, Maria, as we heard there from your last guest, the idea was that the EU-US relationships had reached a turning point following a relatively successful G7 summit. Well, think again when you look at what happened at NATO headquarters today, because Pete Hegseth really lambasted in a very personalised way, I would say, his NATO allies, describing them as shameful for not supporting the United States in the war in Iran. Remember, at the start of the conflict, France, Spain, Italy had denied access to certain military bases and certain air skies in relation to that war. He said they were shameful. He also announced that there will be a troop review of US troops all across Europe with a view to withdrawing troops. He also said that the United States would withdraw funding from the overall NATO budget if member states are not paying their way. This comes at a time when the United States wants to punish European allies for not joining in the war in Iran, for also rejecting calls when the United States asked for help. So he described this as NATO 3.0. Take a listen.
We're doubling down on our effort to make NATO what it always was supposed to be, a balanced alliance with Europe in the lead for its own defense, NATO 3.0. And to make that a reality, I'm announcing today a 6-month Department of War review that will examine America's force posture and basing in Europe. Up to 6 months, could be less. Let's call it the NATO 3.0 review.
Pete Hegseth there saying that he's going to have this troop posture review. This comes at a time, Maria, remember that the United States already said it was withdrawing assets from NATO's force model, meaning that things like F-16s, F-35s, bombers like B-52s will no longer be accessible for NATO allies, even during times of war. Maria?
Well, Shauna, I mean, he came in guns blazing, that's clear, but that kind of language, that kind of bravado, we've heard that before. So you've covered NATO for many years. Help me understand, is this the real deal, or ultimately is this just a tactic heading into that NATO summit in July to make the Europeans pay more, buy more American? Is this a strategy or just a tactic of pressure?
Yeah, it's both, Maria, because I did speak to a NATO source afterwards who said Pete Hegseth is using a stick. He wants to ensure that NATO allies are basically committing to the 5% GDP expenditure on defence, which they said that they would do last year at The Hague. Most countries are coming up to that, but there are several laggards, like, for example, Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg, and a couple of countries who aren't even meeting 2%. But at the same time, we also know that the sentiment within the Trump administration is to withdraw support for the European security architecture. They've made that clear many times over the past 18 months. So, yes, there is more pressure. Yes, the Americans would like the Europeans to buy more weapons, but also they're saying you can handle your own security on your own. We're annoyed with you for rejecting our calls. We wanted help in Iran.
Well, Shauna, thank you for that. And let's stay with the United States and go over to Switzerland. We're joined by our correspondent, Philip Crowther, who is following a ceremony that may or may not happen at this hour. Yesterday, the president of the U.S. signed that deal with Iran, controversial deal in Versailles. The idea was that the vice president of the U.S. would head over to Switzerland and continue that ceremony to showcase the deal. But it seems now that it may not happen at all. Philip, what's going on?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess, isn't it? But I think it's relatively fair to say that that signing ceremony, an official signing ceremony that was supposed to happen on a mountaintop outside of Lucerne here in Switzerland, that is pretty much postponed at this point. We heard earlier from the White House, from U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, he was the one who's supposed to head the U.S. delegation here in Switzerland. He still says that he is planning to come here, not necessarily for a formal signing ceremony, maybe rather for a round of talks with Iran to actually get this memorandum of understanding into an actual lasting deal. The two sides supposed to talk also again, and this has of course happened many times in the recent past, about Iran's nuclear program. Now, you might ask the question, why should they meet anyway for a formal signing ceremony? It's a fair question because the deal has been signed, this MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, signed by Iran in Tehran, signed by US President Donald Trump in Versailles over dinner with his French counterpart, and also signed by the main mediator, by Pakistan, in Islamabad. They were all supposed to be around the table here in Switzerland. They might still, but not for a signing ceremony. That is the most likely outcome.
So that may not go ahead. And have we heard from Tehran in the past few hours?
We expect actually to hear from the supreme leader of Iran in the next hour or so. A written statement is most likely going to be read out on state television. That is how he communicates essentially with the Iranian people and the outside world. This is a deal that most experts would say is pretty favorable to Iran. What it essentially does is it puts everything back to the situation where it was before the US and Israel attacked Iran at the end of February of this year. The main components thereof, the Strait of Hormuz, was closed by Iran during this conflict. It now opens up again, according to this deal. The ceasefire turns into a relatively lasting peace. That at least is the plan, but Iran also gets some other advantages out of this signed deal, and one of them includes that US-backed sanctions on Iranian oil exports are waived for the next 60 days at least. That will be some significant extra income for Iran. That is one of the reasons why most experts are saying, well, this is essentially a bit of a win here for Tehran and not really something that the United States will be proud to be seen signing in an official ceremony. That might be one of the reasons why we aren't expecting US Vice President J.D. Vance here, at least over the next 24 hours or so.
And certainly with that, Philip, you nailed it, because there's been a lot of speculation that ultimately what you have here is a deal in which Iran commits some paper, but they've done it before, to not get the nuclear weapon, but they will get major financial incentives. And the president of the U.S. is already getting backlash back home from a deal that is seen as too soft. But he is getting, however, praise from financial markets. We saw the stock market really responding very positively yesterday to that deal and today. And we've seen oil prices and the oil market and the energy market also responding in a positive light to this deal. But I want to ask you and see what you've picked up in your reporting over the past 24 hours. The president of the U.S. made a promise, and he also made it to the Europeans, that the Strait of Hormuz would reopen on Friday, that it would do so with full freedom of navigation and no payments. At this hour, and the clock is ticking, is the Strait of Hormuz reopening tomorrow?
I think we can certainly say with some certainty that that is happening as we speak, that being the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. There is now increased traffic there. The U.S. Defense Department also now saying that officially it has stopped its U.S. blockade. That's the U.S. Navy blockading Iranian ports to keep Iranian oil from being exported from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz and into the wider oil market. That blockade is over. The Strait of Hormuz should be reopening now slowly but surely. We're seeing some extra traffic there right now as we speak. So those parts of the deal seem to be coming to fruition. It's worth mentioning, though, that, of course, the Strait of Hormuz was entirely open before this war between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other side began. And since then, with the closure of the strait by Iran, it was actually making some extra money with what was essentially a toll system. That for the next 60 days is supposed to come to an end. Again, we say 60 days all the time because that is the period that these two sides have signed up to, during which they are supposed to come up with a wider, more lasting agreement.
Indeed, and thank you, Philip. And that is the irony of it all. Of course, we'll monitor on Euronews every detail, every development. There's a big focus on the Strait of Hormuz and the ceremony, as Philip just said. At this point, it is not going to happen. Meanwhile, this European summit continues here. The 27 leaders continue their talks over the budget, China, but also Ukraine, with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, in attendance. We'll bring you all the details across Euronews and our platforms. This is it for Special Report. Thank you for joining us and have a great night.
Is the European Union still relevant on the world stage? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I can hear going no.
No.
Gloves off.
We are very, very honored to have you here.